Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Stephen Bell, Associate University Librarian at Temple University in Philadelphia. I want to welcome you to today's webcast on participatory librarianship and change agents with our guest, David Lankies from Syracuse University, and we look forward to his presentation. This is our last webcast of the fall semester, and John and I are working on some new webcast ideas for the spring, and we will certainly look forward to having you come back. If this is your first time participating in one of our Blended Librarians online learning community webcasts, we welcome you and hope that you enjoy today's program, and we hope that you'll continue to come back for future programs and be active in our community. Right now, I'd like to turn over the mic to my colleague, John Shank, so he can say hello and share a few words with you.
Hi everyone, I'm John Shank and I'm at Penn State University. I'm an instructional design librarian and I also happen to be the director of our Learning and Teaching Center at the Berks College at Penn State. Before we get started with the main part of the presentation, we'd like to get a sense of how many of you in the audience are participating with 2 or more people in the same location. So if you could just take a second, if you look at the top of your screen, you'll see a green check mark and an X. If you have 2 or more people that you're viewing the presentation with, if you could just go ahead and select that green check mark, and you'll also probably be able to use this green check mark throughout the presentation if there are questions, and usually the green check mark means a yes, and the X obviously means a no. And it looks like a fair number of you have at least 2 or more people, so that's great to know. With that, we're going to go ahead and jump right into the presentation. Thank you all for attending, and I will turn the mic over, and we'll begin.
Thanks, John. So we typically go through the presentation, and then we'll leave some time for your questions and for discussion. But feel free to use the chat box to type in your questions, and John and I will be writing them down, and we'll give those to David when he's done his presentation. And also, I hope you will stay around long enough. We will launch an evaluation at about 3:55 or so. And we greatly appreciate it if you would take our evaluation and let us know what you think of the program and also what your ideas are for future programs. So let me introduce David Lankies. This is his second time as a guest here doing a webcast, so we greatly appreciate him coming back again. And David is Associate Professor at Syracuse University School of Information Studies. He is also the Director of the Information Institute at Syracuse University, and he is also a fellow at ALA's Office for Information and Technology Policy. And you can get more information about David at his website, www.davidlankies.org. Now, John and I had an opportunity to hear David give a presentation about participatory librarianship and the library's conversation a little bit earlier this year at a state association conference, and both John and I felt that what David had to talk about really resonated with us as blended librarians. We really felt that there were some definite commonalities between his message and some of the things we try to do as blended librarians, particularly in the area of being innovative and helping people to learn and what the business of the library is. And I imagine he will say more about that. And more recently, you probably have been seeing David's name in the library literature. He is one of the principals behind a new effort to create what he refers to as a credibility engine. It's called Reference Extract, and it's not designed to try to out-Google Google, but it's designed to harness the intelligence of librarians who are experts in knowing what credible resources are and to try to have an alternate way for people to find information. You can keep up with David and Reference Extract through his blog, Virtual Dave Real Blog. And I would highly recommend to you a recent post he wrote called Have Libraries Lost the Search War? And I think that really tells you a little bit more about David and what his passions are. He says we should go right to the heart of what I've been saying about the need for librarians to be innovators and leaders. And I hope I'm not stealing some of his thunder, but one of the things he said when we heard him speak at the conference that really did get into my brain and has been there since I heard him talk was this idea about librarians needing to be the wave machine and not the wave. And I think that says a great deal about the importance of us being innovators and leaders and not necessarily followers, particularly as it applies to our role in the global information environment. So thanks, David, for being here, and I'm turning the mic over to you now.
Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their day and run through some ideas, and hope we have plenty of time for questions and discussions. And I've been watching what's been going on the Blended Librarian site and on the Learning Times Network, and it's really exciting. And I think it's interesting what's going on, right? We're all developing our new titles of librarianship, and rather than them being based on what we do, reference librarian, cataloging librarian, technical services librarian, increasingly, or where we do it, medical librarian, academic librarian, school librarian, increasingly we're starting to put modifiers in front of our titles about sort of what we want to do or what we think we should do. The blend, well, not necessarily blending each other, but you get my point. The idea of being proactive. Joe Janes, when back in the virtual reference days, would talk about the success of anything is when you drop the modifier. When virtual reference just becomes reference, when digital libraries just become libraries. And I think the same is true probably of both the blended librarian approach and the participatory librarian approach. We work for the day that we can drop these modifiers and really talk about how we work with the profession and how the profession has a common theme, because I think that's a lot of what we're seeing now in the profession is a quest for this common theme, this common structure that's going to help lead us forward. Some of the presentations I give, I talk about the idea of navigation and finding out where we're going, and that phrase, which I wish I'd come up with, I think I propagated, but it came out of an unconference here in upstate New York. And it was the notion that librarians have been spending a lot of time riding waves and looking for waves and trying to be in front of waves and all these other things. We're going to Twitter, we're going to Facebook, we're going to do it all, we're going to do it faster, and we're going to do it better. And sometimes we miss the question about why we're doing them. Sometimes we do them because they seem popular or cool, or they are because we haven't done them before. The Library 2.0 literature, which has some great proponents and some great discussions, but there's also some great sort of reactionary themes in there, that what came before doesn't work. I mean, the joke I used to give is, shouldn't we at least be on librarianship 12.5 after starting at the Library of Alexandria a couple thousand years ago? But what we sought to do here in participatory librarianship is really try and seek some fundamental concepts and some core principles that we can look to advance our own future, and we can look at becoming a more equal party and partner to our communities and to people that we know we need to work with, from technology groups to funding groups to government groups to you name it. And this all started out of an effort, actually, the American Library Association's Office for Information Technology Policy, their Washington office, was trying to get a sense of what are the implications for social networking within libraries. There was some legislation at the time they were concerned about, talking about whether the filters that many public libraries and public schools get with the federal funding, that legislation was talking about what to filter, social networking sites and MySpaces and such. But through that process, it really became clear that it was hard to define what it is they were trying to set policy for or about, and increasingly boards and directors and groups of advisors were having a hard time defining this for themselves. And so we spent some time looking at what is it that's going on in this sort of social network space, and what is a social network, and why are Flickr and Google Maps mashups and Facebook and all these thrown into the same pot? Are they really the same thing? What holds them together, and how can we figure out how to navigate between them? Because if not, we'll end up doing what I'm sure you all do on a daily basis, which is checking 18 different websites so you can be social. And of course, you only have like 5 minutes to be social on each, and so you just end up with this sort of schizophrenic view of I'm going to contribute here, and I hope my Twitter feeds go everywhere I need them to be, and by the way, is anyone reading them? And so we really sat back and said, what's going on here? And we started with things like, well, they're They're about collecting people instead of stuff. And it just wasn't working really well to try and figure out what the common theme from a functional point of view. What do all these functions have in common? And instead, what we started looking at is what was going on in there and what were the role of libraries. And so we ended up with this phrase, participatory librarianship, but really that phrase comes from a very, very central concept, that knowledge is created through conversation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. But at the same time, we were going through this white paper battle of trying to figure out what was going on in the web. I was also teaching a doctoral level seminar, which if you want to talk about schizophrenia from Facebook to doctoral students, that's it. We were talking about theory in librarianship, and frankly, there isn't a lot of theory. Now, I noticed I'm going to look at the participant numbers to see who drops off as I start talking about theory, but I promise it won't be too long. You know, is there a theory in librarianship? And we academics and social scientists in the library schools care a lot about it because this is sort of, you know, we got to have theory so we can talk to the economist and still be cool in the faculty club. But really, what theory gives you is the ability to describe what's happening and predict what's coming up, right? And so we need theory. But a lot of it out there is trying to come up with a theory of libraries, which, no offense, but it's like having a theory of General Motors. You know, it's an artificial creation. It's something that we build, and libraries really should represent something more fundamentally human than, oh, there's a collection over there, let's go see how they catalog them. And so we were looking for some much deeper theory, which we'll get into. But we ended up with learning theory, which once again makes a great bridge between what folks are doing in the blended librarianship and what folks are doing in participatory librarianship. I really think we're probably calling the same thing two different terms. But knowledge is created through conversation, and I'm going to describe that in a minute. And if libraries are in the knowledge business, and I haven't found too many librarians who stand up and say, by God, I'm in the warehousing business, or forget it, I'm in the thing business, or I'm in the artifact business. But if we're in the knowledge business, if we're out to be in learning, whether that's in an academic setting or a school setting or a public setting or a corporate setting or whatever setting it is, if we're out to make people's knowledge better, to enable better decision making, we're in the conversation business. And what's really interesting is if you look at what we do and how we allocate our time and our resources and our discussion and our tools and our processes and our policies, they're very few about conversations and mostly about the artifacts that come out of those conversations. So I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time in some of this. I'm going to talk about how it sort of has ripple effects. But I did want to dip a little bit more into the theory about why I say that. So the fellow there on the right hand of your screen is Gordon Pask. And Gordon Pask was a theorist working in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and he was a cybernetician working on cybernetics. And what the goal of cybernetics at the time was to create really responsive machines, and the ultimate goal was artificial intelligence at the time. And so he wanted to teach machines how to think. And so what he did is he said, well, rather than starting with things that can't think, machines, I'm going to start with things that can, people, and see how they learn. And so what he ended up coming up with a general purpose learning theory. And it comes out to the idea that learning, you learn through conversation. And that a conversation consists of conversants, which are the people or things involved in these. They consist of the language that's interchanged between those conversants, agreements that they seek out, and a memory of those conversations. Now, rather than talking about the abstract, I have pretty pictures to show. So here are the pretty pictures. So this is Bob. You always have to have a guy named Bob, and Bob's a user. And that hole in Bob's head is a gap in his knowledge. That means he has a question. He has something he doesn't know. Now, if you ever want to read the best article ever written in librarianship from my consideration, you go back to 1968 and read Bob Taylor's Question Negotiation. And he talks about what that blob is and how the fact is that often it starts as an unstated need, which means he doesn't even know what he needs to know. And that by the time they get to asking a question of a reference librarian, it's gone through this whole sort of translation process to come out as a compromise need. But for now, it's a gap, something he needs to know. Now, where does that gap come from? Well, that gap comes from what he already knows. That's sort of the pre-existing knowledge, those other dots in the upper left-hand corner. And it comes from a sense of motivation, something making him deal with this. Either internally motivated, he wants to know, I redid our kitchen here, and the idea was that I had this wonderful tile backsplash. And, oh, by the way, I see Bob Taylor, Taylor, or ER. I think it's OR. I apologize. Anyway, so I had to redo our kitchen. It had a tile backsplash, and either I paid a lot of money to get someone to take out the tile, or I sat there with a hammer and did it, which got all my destructive urges out, which is good. The problem was that I also realized that when one takes out tile, they tend to take out the drywall behind it, and so either I could pay a lot of money for someone to do it, or I could learn how to drywall. So in this case, I was very internally motivated to go ask that question. And frankly, public librarians love these because a lot of the questions that happen at a public librarian are intrinsically motivated questions. When we educate people, we have very self-motivated people who come in with their questions. And I'm generalizing here, but in academic and school libraries, we deal a lot with the other type of motivation, meaning someone tells you got to do something. Someone walks in and says, I have a paper due next week and I got to get this kind of citation, and the reference interview goes with, well, what kind of citation? And the answer is a citation. And why do you need it? Because I gotta. It goes back and forth between it was assigned. So there are lots of different reasons for someone asking a question. And in fact, it's important, and in learning theory we know it's very important to understand what's motivating someone behind doing this. Because if they're not intrinsically motivated, you can give them the richest answer possible and they'll ignore it all for the essential part of what they need to accomplish as their task. If they're internally motivated, they're easily distracted because they tend to be able to jump and want to jump ahead of you and jump to different topics. So motivation is important. All right, so what happens with this? Well, what's going to happen is our user here, Bob, is going to go explore a domain, that's the vertical axis, and he's going to explore it over time, that's the horizontal axis, and on top he's going to change what he knows. And Pask was really clear that he talked about knowing and not knowledge because it's an active and dynamic process. So how is he going to go about changing what he knows? Well, he's going to engage in conversations. Now, some of those conversations are going to be with librarians, some of them are going to be with their friends, and a lot of them are going to be with himself. When Pask talks about conversants, a conversant isn't just necessarily another person. It can be a group of people. I'm talking to a group of people. We're having a conversation, albeit a primarily one-way conversation for now, but there's a conversation going on. It can be between two individuals, what we think of as a conversation. It can be between two groups. For example, when a library sits down to negotiate a contract with a vendor, it's two organizations having a conversation. And it goes the other way. It can be with the individual. When the individual is reading, when you're reading something and you're trying to figure out what is he talking about, who are you talking to? You're talking to yourself. And so we do a lot of this. Now, this isn't that crazy because we know from learning theory that there's things called metacognition and there's things called critical thinking and looking at our own thinking process and such. So it's not too radical of a concept. And all the public librarians out there who mutter about people talking to themselves in front of the reference desk, I hear ya. But that's what we need to do. And it's interesting because when we talk about reading, are you really having a conversation with the author or are you having a conversation with yourself around the words that you're getting from that author? So, and what's happening through these conversations? Well, through these conversations, Bob is exchanging language back and forth. And we can spend some time on language, but it comes down to really low-level language, which tends to be very directional. I don't know much about what's going on, but where do I go? What do I do? A lot of conversations when you're exploring something new start this way. What should I read? Right? Number one question that I get after most conference presentations is, what blog should I read? Or what article should I read? Well, they're directional, right? We're not really going to talk about the substance until we have enough background. So the L0 language, the basic language is do this, do that, do this, do that. Which, as we all know, is like the worst possible computer training you can get. Well, first you click here, and then you click here, and then you click there. And you sit there and go, well, why am I clicking? Well, then you click here, and right? They ignore the questions because it's very directional. The level of language on top of that is really substantive. So in a group of librarians, when I talk about the catalog, very few people stop and go, what does J.C. Penney's have to do with this? And how does picking toys out of the Sears catalog? Do we all just take a moment to remember the Sears catalog of our youth? Anyway, it's holiday season. I can't help but doing that. So we think we sort of know what catalog means for this group. Through this language exchange, we come up with agreements. Oh, yes, I agree with you here. So, for example, I notice what's happening through this discussion is we've just had a discussion about who Bob Taylor is. And by the way, he was the dean of School of Information Studies. He's the one who changed the name from library science from library science to information studies, and was a reference librarian. Just a great guy. Anyway, that is a higher level conversation about, well, what did Bob Taylor say about this? What does he mean by negotiated? What do you mean by these things? And so the agreement that was reached here is, this is the Bob Taylor we're talking about. And this is published in 1968. So that's an agreement. That sticks. So those agreements consist of what we agree upon. This is the Bob Taylor we're talking about. This is the article we're talking about. An artifact that may have come from, I learned that from this chat session going on in the blended librarian conversation. And probably a conversant. So-and-so said this. Texas Taylor said this. And we also know, you'll see that fading a little bit, because cognitive psychology will tell us over time where we got it from and who we were talking from begins to fade, but the agreement remains the same, which is a really interesting basis when you start talking about issues of credibility, because as we know, if you repeat something often enough, that agreement will sink into people's head and they'll forget that it came from a source refuting it. In fact, what's interesting is right now we talk about I was just reading an article about the phrase the best and the brightest. And when they're talking about the Obama administration's picking the best and the brightest, meaning, the most qualified people. That phrase actually came from a book discussing the Kennedy administration and how it ended up getting us mired in Vietnam, and best and brightest was meant ironically. But because we've heard it in the context of a positive way, we've come to think of it as a positive. We forget where it came from and even its original meaning. But my point is, this is how people learn. And if we're in the knowledge business, our systems need to reflect that, not necessarily how many things we've got, or what are the nature of the things, or where can we put the things, even if they're digital things. So what this leads to is a logic, if you will. So one of the things it says is, first of all, the user is in control of this process. If the user is the one with the question, if learning is a conversation, and conversation is an active concept, you cannot have a literal one-way conversation. We used to talk about, if in learning you used to hear about the sage on the stage versus the guide on the side, right? The sage on the stage was that you are all but empty buckets sitting out there, and I am throwing bricks of knowledge over the tubes, and they're rattling around, and some of them stick and some of them don't. Well, that's not a passive process. You have to sort of be engaged. You have to be willing to listen. You have to be willing to think about it, incorporate it to what you already know, and respond. That's what a conversation is, and that's an active process. And if we're worried about the user's learning, then they are in control of that process, because they get to decide when to listen, when not to listen, how to process, how not to process. That means they're in control throughout the whole process. This is not just sort of a nice euphemism or a politically correct thing to say about user-based design. This quite literally means that if the user is not engaged and if the user doesn't run the process, it's not working. It's all about learning. It is all about learning. I don't care if you're pointing to a stack, if you're answering a reference question, or if you're doing cataloging records. It comes down to, how is this going to fundamentally enrich a conversation, enrich learning? There isn't a part of the library that isn't about learning. You can't say, that's the instructional staff's problem, because why are you here? Learning is a collaborative conversation. Once again, it's a two-way street. Everyone's got to be involved, and increasingly a social process. I gave a demonstration of some software I'm not going to talk about here, but it's called Scapes, and it was a sort of a new virtual reference package, and I showed, Dave has a question, he logs on, he brings his friend in, and they talk about something, and then they bring a reference librarian, and they talk about something, and the reaction was, what do you mean they bring the reference librarian in third? I'm like, please, give me a break. If you have a question, even if you have a question, yeah, the person sitting next to you may be a reference librarian, but did you ask the question because they were a reference librarian, or because they were sitting next to you? Or what about, we don't ask that cooking question because that's, my mom's the best cook in the world. I ask her that question, or whatever it is. It's a social process. We need to start realizing that when we're in this learning process, it's not just what happens between the librarian and a patron, in the library. It's what happens in the patron's learning process, of which the library may be a stop along the way, and they're a part of. That the library, and particularly librarians, serve as facilitators of conversations. Now, what does that mean? That means that our job is not to teach necessarily. Our job is to facilitate. It's to get access to the information they need. So what is facilitation? First of all, is access. So if I want to learn about something, I need access to that conversation. So if that conversation is happening on the Learning Times website, I need to know what the URL is, what computer, how do I get this software, what do you mean I need Java, what's Java, all that kind of access stuff. And if you look at libraries, we do that by providing meeting rooms, we do that by providing open public access computers, but we also do that by, frankly, providing a collection, because all the collection is an access question. This is the artifacts of millions and millions of conversations distilled into these objects, and we are providing access to them. But access is insufficient for learning. A lot of what we teach processes and concentrate on is access, and yet it's a small part of it. I have a 5.5-year-old. Here is how not to teach a 5.5-year-old how to read. Walk him into the stacks of the public library and walk away. And say, look, you're surrounded by reading. Why can't you read? Because we know it takes more than that. It takes access, and it takes knowledge. Knowledge is what's fundamental, what understandings, what agreements do I need to have in place before I scaffold them into new agreements and new learning. So a lot of people talk about the idea that, early in the days of computers in schools, everyone said, oh my God, these computers are horrible. Look at how much you have to teach people how to use them. Why can't we just go back to books? Books are simple. Well, yeah, we only take the first, 8 years of public education to teach people this interface called books, which is reading and what an index is and how to use a table of contents, right? So, if you're going to have access to the conversation, but it's in Spanish, you need knowledge about how do I translate the Spanish or how do I speak Spanish. But that's not enough. So I get you to the conversation, you have the fundamentals to engage in the conversation, but do you have an environment that allows you to do that? So we talk a lot about freedom of intellectual freedom and access within the library domain, which means you are in a safe environment. A safe environment means physical safety. I don't think I'm going to be mugged, but it also means intellectual safety. I don't think I'm going to be torn down or torn left and right from this, or that the FBI is going to come look at what I did. And the last thing is we need to worry about the motivation, recognizing why they're doing it and encouraging them based upon that. So those are the 4 parts of facilitation: access, knowledge, environment, and motivation. And that's what facilitation is, not just access. Moving on. That true facilitation with the community means shared ownership with the community. That oftentimes we think of ourselves as being of service to the community, but that means that we are separate from them, and we need to stop that. One thing that I talk a lot about is that public libraries have started looking at gaming as a way of encouraging team participation. And I asked them if one of their main fundamental goals of the library is to get greater team participation, how many teams do they have on their boards? Because if you don't trust them to help run your organization, why should they trust you to serve their needs? So in academic libraries we have, underclassmen advisors. Well, what do we do with that? We have a very simplistic view overall of identity within a library. It's sort of librarian or not librarian. If the president of a university walks in and sees that their book is miscatalogued, there's a wrong something in the catalog record, do they have the ability to change it, or do they have to go to a librarian to get them to change it? Okay, who's the librarian, who's not the librarian, right? We need to do, what about the physicists? Why can't we let them add information to our pathfinders on physics? Whether they want to or not is a different question. What do we do with people that are really committed to the library and want a greater role in the library, have proven ability in it? How can we grant them entrance to the kingdom besides waiting for them to send them off for a master's degree? And finally, if this is all about conversation, and if we're in the job of facilitating it, that means we're in the job of knowledge creation and not simply knowledge storage. And so we need to look at investing increasingly in tools of creation over the artifacts of creation. We started using the metaphor around the Institute of librarians. One model of librarians is as shovel and catcher's mitt. That in one arm they shovel information at it, and the other end they wait with a catcher's mitt to catch what comes out. So a researcher walks in, and they're going to do a research project on medieval tapestries. So what do? We shovel every citation we could ever find about medieval tapestries at them. They go off, distill, think, do their process, do their thinking, do their research, write an article, and there we are with the catcher's mitt to grab that article at the end. Well, why aren't we throughout that entire process? And yes, there are going to be plenty of examples where we are, and I want to encourage them, and I think we should be actively talking about that. So we need to be thinking about this. Once again, public library example, if we want to talk about kids talking about music, do we give them access to sound record booths and put out podcasts of theirs? We've seen a lot of the creation of the information commons within library environments where we don't simply have a lab over here and the library over here, we put them together. Because we realize that kids and adults and teachers think and create simultaneously, and therefore we shouldn't separate out that process. So what I really want to quickly talk about is one example of this. It's one that I picked because you may have seen some in the news, which is what can we do with this knowledge structure? That's what this is, a map of someone's knowledge. And we know that they're going to examine knowledge in both a digital environment and a physical environment and a hybrid environment. For example, you have to go to the library to search the online database. Well, imagine if what we could do is capture not just these agreements but their relationships together. That, in fact, we have this discussion, we learn this whole new way about understanding tapestry, but we know that it was a process that started from this article, led to this article, led to this experiment, led to this discussion, led to this presentation, led to this article, that kind of relationship. If we can capture that, one of the things we're trying to do is think about in reference extract how that can be used in terms of search, because we know, for example, that people, by and large, see that librarians as trustworthy. This is a site coming out of a study from the University of North Carolina looking at the libraries and museums and their impact, and they were looking at their websites, and they asked patrons, they asked users, which source do they find most trustworthy, and that's what this panel is. And so they've asked things like, between a library website, a museum website, Archives Historical Association, Geographical Society, government websites, commercial websites, and private industry. By and large, they found libraries to be the most extremely trustworthy source. So we know that if people ask librarians, they're going to trust what they get. Now, how can we use this to influence how people can find better and more useful stuff? Because I should be really clear here, when I talk about libraries as facilitators, that doesn't mean transparent, invisible servants. That means that, a lot of the question is, well, if people are having conversations, and if two stupid people get together and have a stupid conversation, does that really mean they've learned? Well, the answer is they've changed how they think about it. But does that mean that librarians should be satisfied with that outcome? No, I don't think so at all. But we see on the web what's happening is you look at something at Google. So this is a really, really simple view of Google's PageRank. And what Google does is they go around and they look at each individual website and see how many things link to it. And those things that are sort of most linked to, most often, are seen as the highest ranked result. And it turns out that this ranking, based more or less on popularity or linking popularity, is an excellent, remarkably good substitute for things like relevance and popularity and importance. But we know that it can be twisted a lot. We know that, for example, if you search for Britney Spears, you're going to find more information from the blogosphere. If you search for Apple online, you'll find the computers for the first 50 pages, and then the fruit starts after that. We'll know that they tend to send you to commercial sites versus non-commercial sites. So we also know about Google bombing, where a lot of bloggers point to one resource with a phrase, and suddenly they can change Google's behavior. So what if, instead of just taking the open organic web, we looked at the citations that librarians use? Not out of the blue, not just, hey, quick, what do you think is good? But if we look at what they actually send to users when they ask questions. What if we built that reference weighting, where the number one result are the things that are most cited by credible sources, in this case, librarians? And so what we've come up with is a very simple architecture where these dots represent different things. So a person, for example, pointing to a website. What the web world, the web search world does now is they say website points to website, and that's all they know. And there's a great line that a mentor of mine, Chuck McClure, once said. He was talking in academic terms that if you want to be cited, how to be cited well. He said the way to be most cited is you either say it first, you wrote the seminal piece that everyone has to point to. You say it last, you wrote the summative piece that everyone points to. Or you say it's stupid because everyone has to point to you before they contradict you. Well, in web linking, you don't know which of those they're pointing to. So the first thing we can do is we can first of all say, well, what about different agents pointing to websites? So website pointing to websites, one. What about librarian pointing to website? Or doctor pointing to website? Or journalist pointing to website? And we know that librarians point to a lot more than just websites. What about librarians pointing to books and CDs and people and organizations? And then what if we can capture what that credible agent, that librarian, is relating about that object? So endorses, disagrees with, highly supports, thinks is great for 3-year-olds, etc. So if we can capture that, that becomes a really fancy word. That becomes a topology that we can then build a search engine off of. And this is a reference extract, and this is sort of where we were when the press release went out, and it's interesting, it's kind of a Rorschach test when you look at the press. A lot of it is, librarians take on Google, and a lot of that language came from, please, someone take on Google. We're looking for a fight. But we've really evolved much beyond that, where once we have those relationships, yes, we can feed that to search engines, but we can feed it to whole things. So we can take that information and we can build a search engine out of it. Classic search engine where, let me get my little highlighter here. You can search up here for what you want, and you can get the results here. We can get classifications over here, and we can even find out how many times it was cited. And you can imagine if users, though they tend not to, wanted to go further to find out, well, who said that? And now rank things from my own library higher than others. But we are also talking about a custom interface that we could hand back to you, so Temple could take this and say, anything from Temple reference librarians get bumped up a little bit more than everyone else, or things from academic sources get bumped up a little bit more than these. And we can even show how they're related to other resources that may be out there. But we can take this, for example, and instead of taking on major search engines, let's pretend this is a major search engine, I have no idea which, that they can send back results, but those results, those results could also, for example, have a little icon over here saying, this and this resources were considered credible by librarians. So Google could take the results and run it through here, or Yahoo or MSN, and they could highlight what are credible results that librarians see. We could also imagine embedding them in catalogs so that here's a standard catalog listing, but where those resources have been discussed by reference librarians, you could imagine popping up more resources like this. So it's not just a search engine. That's what we're talking about with credibility search engine. Yes. And we can talk about a general search utility, so we can embed it in browsers, but we can also embed it in virtual reference systems so that we can really use cumulative knowledge in answering questions over time. And building a back end of this. Where am I going with this? Now, there are a lot of implications to this approach, one of which is that reference extract we just showed, but I want to talk about another one. Right? So if you think about for a moment, when you sort of say, wait, if libraries are in the conversation business, what's the implication of that? Well, I want to look at one implication of that, and that's the implication for innovation and the need for innovation within the library profession. One of the ripples I talked about reference extract. There's another system we talk about called Scapes. You can find that stuff on my website. Another thing is in physical libraries, that a lot of times when people are coming into libraries, they need a curriculum, not an answer. So, for example, we talked about business centers in public libraries when we were talking with Philly Free. And Philly Free wanted to build a business center. They wanted to look at what is the next generation of a business collection. And the answer was, we get lots of entrepreneurs who walk in here, and they want to know how to start small businesses, but they don't know where to start, and a book's not going to help them. They need to know, first need to do a business plan. This is what a business plan looks like. These are the fundamental components of a business plan. Next, you're going to need a mentor. Hey, let's go take a field trip out to some successful startup businesses. Next, you're going to need access to capital. We're going to have Thursday night, we're going to bring in venture capitalists and bankers that you can pitch to. Then you're going to need a lawyer. Then you're going to need an accountant. In other words, they needed to be taught. And that's not just access. All that information's on the shelf. They really need a step 1, step 2, step 3 process. But once again, I want to talk about, and there's some URLs that you can follow up on. What is the implication for librarians? And it's interesting because I find it fascinating that the blended librarian group and we have ended up at the same place, which is this is fundamentally about innovation. And I think sometimes that seems like a forced discussion. Like, of course, it's all about innovation. We're so innovative, you should be too. But that's not what it's about. There's a fundamental reason that these kind of learning systems lead to an innovation approach, and I want to talk about that. when I talked about people learning, the notion is that people need to be engaged. They need to be at the center. Our patrons, our members, Joan Fry Williams' much better term, which instead of talking about patrons or users, think of them as members. When the members of our libraries need to feel ownership, need to be in control, this creates a pressure for participation. People need to construct their knowledge. They want tools, and we've seen this pressure show up in things like infrastructure. Way back when, wide area networks used to look like AOL and CompuServe and Prodigy, and they were proprietary systems where you could control nothing other than what number you called up to. If you wanted more bandwidth, too bad. Well, the internet came and said, look, we can do this in a cooperative way where people can decide what infrastructure they want. And so we started to create the internet approach, and in fact that participatory approach where the internet is just a network of networks has really replaced the dominant model of we build this sort of unified infrastructure. We've seen that in the application world, where, once again, AOL and Prodigy said, here's the email package. This is the email you will use, and I don't care if you don't like it, has led to really the idea of, wait a minute, I don't like your email package. I'm going to buy another one because it all works on the same standard. And if I don't find one I like, I can write one. This is the origin of open source software. The notion that people want to participate in this. You can see this, for example, in the whole discussion of electronic voting. That one approach says, oh, the way you make it secure is that you clamp it down and you hammer down the system so no one can see what's in it. And a lot of people say, no, no, no. The way you make something secure is you develop it in an open world like Linux or Apache where everyone can try and break it and everyone can see where it can be broken and everyone can fix it. So that's a different approach. We've seen it now in information services. People are looking at our catalogs and saying, what do you mean I can't annotate what I like? What do you mean I can't add my own terms? What do you mean I can't see a history of what I've done? And so people really want to now control the information. We see that with Mashup. Well, what do you mean you can't show me a map view? No problem. I can just take your data and I can put Google Map and I can create my own map view. And so information services like us are having to respond to the fact that people don't just want to consume anymore. They want to shape the world around them. And this isn't a vanity thing. This is a necessity thing. I think a lot of people look at Facebook and Flickr and say, oh, this is just people who want to sort of get famous. And it's people who want the system to make sense. And when they look at things like GeoCities and Encarta and look at the encyclopedias, they say, those don't think like I do. I want a system that does. And they move to a Wikipedia and a MySpace and a Facebook that allow them to organize the world the way they see it. That's what we all do. That's why we organize our own shelves. That's why we put our desktops the way we do, because we want to participate. And so we also see it at the use level where people want to create social communities where they do decision making in a group. But there's a connection here. If conversations and learning are about change, because that's what learning is. When you teach someone, you change someone. When you truly teach someone, you engage them in a process in which you facilitate, because you can't force it, but you facilitate, you enable someone to change their worldview. That's a pretty awesome task to take on and a pretty noble task, but it means that we're in the change business. It means that every day that we want to increase knowledge in our community is every day we want to change our community for the better. Because facilitation, as I said, is not invisible, it's not unbiased, it's to shape. I want to be real clear, I don't believe in the notion of being unbiased. I don't think it's actually possible to be non-biased. I think it's possible to be intellectually honest about your biases. When someone asks you a question and you lead them to a book or an electronic resource first, you've shown a bias. When you wake up in the morning and get in your car assuming that it will start, you've shown a bias. You've shown an assumption. You've shown a heuristic. You've acted and behaved the way you think the world is. That you can't change. And so you can be intellectually honest and say, I'm going to show you a book. Do you want an electronic database first? Because I'll push that back. Or, I like these resources, but you may not. Or, there are all these different views, but you should understand that some views are better explained than others, or some are more believed than others. Innovation is also learning, and learning is an act of activism. That if we are truly participatory, and if we truly buy into the notion of learning, we must buy into the notion of innovation. We must change. We must start looking at learning not as a process whereby I have the knowledge, you come in, and I deliver it to you. And instead look at it as I am trying to figure out the future and I invite you to join me, or you're trying to figure out the future, will you invite me on your team? And that notion of constantly looking at knowledge as change, constantly looking at knowledge as understanding, means we must also be in the change behavior. We're not done yet. One of the things that drives me nuts is the idea that somehow librarianship is a completed task. The only completed profession in the world are ones that don't exist anymore. Scriveners don't have to have a lot of discussion about what they're going to do next because we don't need them, right? What we need to do is to constantly be reinventing ourselves, constantly learning, constantly engaged in innovation. And we need to make sure that we are doing that in tight coordination and connection with the communities of which we are a part. And so that means that by necessity, if we are in the knowledge and conversation business, we're also in the innovation business, because the world is constantly changing and we must constantly change to adopt it. Now, what's really impressive to know is that when I talk about obligation, I think a lot of people sort of see Steve Jobs flash into their head. And when you talk about innovation, they sort of see Albert Einstein pop into their heads. And they have these sort of, oh my God, Edison was an innovator. And it becomes this sort of pedestal-like, austere, godlike ability not granted to too many people. But in truth, innovation happens from core knowledge. It's everyone's job. This is Danny Biasone. And the reason I point him out is that he's a big Syracuse legend, because he used to own the Nats, the Syracuse Nationals, and he was a basketball team, professional basketball team. And he's the one who put into effect the shot clock. Now, you don't have to know much about basketball, but you should know this, that currently, if you play basketball and you get the ball, the minute you cross the center line, a clock starts counting down, and you have 24 seconds in which to shoot the ball and try and make a basket. It wasn't always that way. It used to be that as soon as you got ahead, you would dribble real slowly, and you would sit there. And so basketball games used to have scores like 30-14 and 20-8, and it was boring. And so what he said is, wait, 24 seconds. Now this is, you think, not a big innovation for him, not this huge sort of impact. But what he did, by understanding the idea of the game, is he created a faster paced game that led to greater audience appreciation and participation, which led to the emerging television market taking greater attention, which led to a larger marketplace in television contracts for the NBA, which led to the NBA we know today. The simple notion of trying to speed up the game, something he knew very well in how to keep the audience engaged, turned into a massive change in media and sports in this world. The same thing can be said that I'm not asking you to sit back and think about how to innovate the entire library profession, but you need to think about how to innovate what you do on a daily basis. And yellow Post-its and blue Post-its may seem really small, but if there's a positive improvement of using one versus the other, that's an innovation, and that's the business you should be in. We all need to be in that business. We get so obsessed with process and implementation of process that we forget that the process had to come from somewhere. I get really tired of people telling me, oh, that's not the way the library does it. Well, the library is a bunch of books and shelves and bricks. Library doesn't do anything other than sit there and collect dust. It's the people that make the library work. It's librarians that make a library, right? We're the ones that work on circulation and collection development and understanding the conversation and engagement, right? We need to be constantly innovating what that space looks like. The mission of our library needs to be to facilitate knowledge creation of our community through conversation. Not collecting stuff for 100 years from now, not opening on Sundays. It's what does it take to improve the decision making of our community by facilitating those learning, to change the community for a better. We're an activist organization. Libraries, it amazes me that people are still willing to look at libraries and think of them as conservative, slow-moving organizations. And if they do, shame on us. Because we have the ability to change society. That's what we need to be in. We're in the knowledge business. I mean, what arrogance we have. First of all, good for us. What position we're in to think about this and say, we are libraries are aspirational institutions. Why did Carnegie build temples? Because he looked at libraries and said, you are the best of this community and you deserve a building that looks that way. And when you look at things, that tradition continues in Salt Lake City and Seattle and elsewhere. We look at these as temples of knowledge. And we need to say, that's great, but we need the people in it to make it work. Libraries must be agents of change. We can no longer hide behind our collections. Libraries are not about the past, but using the past, and particularly the present, to invent the future. We collect materials and resources not to puff up our shelves or take more storage space. We use them to make better decisions. And we need to constantly say, not report how many circs we have or how many people walk through the door or all these kind of statistics. We need to say, we had an economic development crisis in this country, and this is how we improved the lives of people who were laid off. Here are the specific number of people we dealt with. Here are the services we put them through. Here are the jobs they got. I was interested in talking to a student doing a study on business startups in libraries, and they said they were talking to librarians, and the librarians, they were asking, what's their impact? And not a librarian could say, oh, these businesses were started by coming and being part of this. They said, oh, what are they supposed to do, report to us when they start a business? Well, if you're a partner, they would certainly tell their friends and their partners about it. If you're invested in their success, you should be invested in what they do and what comes out of it. We can no longer serve from the side. We must be active and participate in the improvement of our communities and larger societies. We need to be an active social force and not simply a passive one. We are perfectly situated to do this. We function as authorities, not authoritarians. What does that mean? I mean, it means that a lot of the discussion in the early internet in the library discussion was, oh, the libraries will collect the good stuff and all the other stuff can go on the internet. Well, who are you to say what's good or bad? It's what helps someone learn is what's good or bad, and that's contextual, that's situational, and that's a user determination. And the idea that libraries are seen as authorities comes from the fact that we are seen as trusted sources that are willing to give and be open and honest about our biases and make them apparent, not we've pre-decided what's good or bad. That's an authoritarian view. We need to be honest brokers and in the community. We're tool builders. This is one of the things that drives me nuts, right? If you say, oh, these techies, and they talk about all these three-letter acronyms, and it's horrible. Well, trust me, a librarian can go toe-to-toe with any techie in terms of three-letter acronyms. Good Lord. Between Mark and, all ACR2 and what happened to ACR1 and, oh, I'm part of this organization. And if it doesn't have an acronym, it can't be put into a committee at ALA. We could bear someone down to death with the number of alphabets that we can produce, right? So we need to realize that those are tools. And whether they're technology tools and software and websites or books or pathfinders or reading groups or children's reading sessions, those are tools and we build them, and we need to understand why we build them and where they need to come. But ultimately, one of our best processes is that we still exist as a connective tissue across the span of our communities. There are very few social organizations, whether you're talking in an academy, whether you're talking in a business, whether you're talking in a school, whether you're talking about in a municipality or federal government. There are very few agencies anymore that effectively provide service to almost every member of that community, right? Well, this is the social services group. They deal with the disadvantaged. And this is the children's group. They deal with children. This is elderly. They deal with elderly. And this is the library. We deal with them all. And we connect them all together. And that's powerful. And in academic situations, every time a provost talks about we need a multidisciplinary approach, libraries should cheer out loud. And they should also, by the way, get up, walk over, knock on the door of the provost and say, we're here to help. And we want to be part of that process because we're already multidisciplinary. We must be prepared. We must become radical change agents and realize that it's not enough to sit back and smile and be pretty, though you're all terribly pretty. But we must understand that this is going out into the community and being loud about our value. Fix our innovation cycle. We can't just hire out innovation. We all are in the innovation business, no matter how many years or what your status is. Your job is innovation. We must fix our education system. Why is it that 2.5 years of preparation at the beginning of our career is the fundamental preparation for everything that we do for the next 30 years? I mean, can you really say that what you learned at your MLS taught you how to analyze a budget and work in the political system of being a director of a large municipal library? I think we need to talk about bachelor's degrees. I think we need to talk about master's degrees. We've already got professional studies degrees. Syracuse got one. There's my shout out to Syracuse. You should look at them. PhDs. But we need coherent continuing education opportunities so that you don't just have to pick it up from a blog post or two. You can actually be part of it. We need to fix our innovation economy and not assume that we can just buy our way into new stuff, but we can create it. And our vendors need to understand that they are more marketplaces than solution providers, that if a good idea comes from a library, they can be the one that can take it and market and feed back part of that profit back to the library to support its basic function in the new innovation and new core. Right? So we have an obligation, and it's the obligation to lead. We have an obligation to innovate from our core principles, which means we need them, which means, as I saw one of the beginning chat sessions was, a little theory would help. We need to understand why we're doing these things, and it's not just because it's new, but it's because we understand where it fits and we understand what it means. We need to question tradition. The two most important questions you must ask are why and why not. When you do a process or you go through a lifelong meeting process, you have to ask, why are we doing this? Right? Now, it's fundamentally important you ask the second question. Why not? Why are we doing this? Can't we change this process? Why not? Should we blog? Why not? Right? The answer, by the way, you should be willing to get a yes or, a positive or a negative response to each of those, but you should ask them. We need to hold the visionaries to account. It's one thing for Dave Lankus to log in and tell us all this wonderful stuff. We can say, I went through my hour and now I'm an innovator. But the truth is, I don't get to come to your library for 40 hours a week and try and make this change. You need to hold me to account to say, Dave, where's the data? How does this prove? What's your theory? Talk to me about it. Convince me. But at the same time, you need to be the one that actually does it. I'm a very unimportant part of this process. You should, any loud voice like me that gets up and talks about it, all we can do is expose and provide access to the ideas. It's up to you to do the real hard stuff. And so you need to make sure that we reflect reality when we do the loud talking, and you reflect reality when you go out and do it. You need to become a mentor. We need to make sure that everyone, no matter how experienced or inexperienced, is busy trying to make the next person in line even more successful than they were. Ultimately, you're the future of libraries. If we exist or are irrelevant in 10 years, it's your fault, it's my fault. We're the ones who are responsible. There's nothing on the world that came down and said, thou shalt be libraries. It's a social construct, and so society, the people within it, must define it every day. And so everyone in your library organization, from the person who opens the door and cleans the floors to goes to the big meetings to shakes the hand of the mayor, everyone in that organization is responsible for inventing the future. There's more information about me and about what's going on, and I will shut up and take any questions you may have. I'll give up the mic.
David, thanks very much for the presentation. There was a lot there and a lot of great ideas, including the one about be the wave machine, not the machine. I hope that we have a couple of extra minutes here, and we'll launch the evaluation just shortly, so we can capture that, or we can do it now while we're talking. But just to maybe start off the questions, we hopefully have time for a couple. Dave, you say we're in the conversation business, but what does it really mean for a library to say that we're in a business? When you say this to librarians, they say we're not in a business. We don't make profits. We don't keep financial records and all this other nonsense. Does it mean that? Are you saying that to be in a business means we're passionate about this, that we understand what our core values are, and we've integrated into things that we do day to day, year to year, and so on?
I may be one of we are in a horrible, terrible national economic crisis, and I don't mean to make light of it, but this little part of me is really thrilled that at least 6 months before I don't have to hear, boy, if we could only run our schools, our libraries, etc., more like Wall Street. That's nice to hear. When I say business, it's a good point. I mean, I usually mean domain or area. And I really think that librarianship is a vocation, not just an occupation. It's something that we do bring passion to. It's something that librarians, I think, are incredible scholars, incredible advocates, incredible social workers, incredible teachers. We have the opportunity to really excel in being change agents. And that's a noble occupation. That's a noble vocation. That's a noble calling, and I think all too often we shy away about those big concepts of changing society and being noble. And I know it's hard when you're changing toner cartridges and pointing to the bathroom to feel that you're a noble agent in society, and yet that's why we're there. And if we remind ourselves about that more often, and if we then remind the public that we serve more often about that, we elevate our status and our ability to do good. And so I think, one, we need to be good business people and that we need to be good financial stewards of the resources given to us. But ultimately what I mean is that we have the ability to be a profession and a vocation that has the ability to change society, and really need to approach it with that passion.
Hope, perhaps at this point we can launch our evaluation, and that would come in the form of a URL that you can then go to and take you just 2 minutes to fill it out or less. And while we do that, we did have a question that someone asked. Someone wanted to know what was the difference between the reference RefX and InfoMine, or maybe Librarians Index to the Internet. I imagine these other websites were efforts to have librarians compile credible websites. And how is Reference Extract different? Is it just that it's more like a search engine rather than a directory?
Great question. Great question. And I want to first of all point out that librarians have been doing great things in terms of web search and identifying good resources for a long time, including Librarians Index the Internet, Internet Public Library, these kinds of things. A couple of differences in our approach. The first difference, which actually is not that fundamental of a difference, but the first difference is we wanted to be ingrained in actual processes that are ongoing. In other words, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of reference interviews are conducted each day. Rather than asking a librarian to add yet a new task and a new activity and go to a new interface to sort of add this information outside of their current work, the idea is to capture knowledge that's being generated daily, which helps us with some scale issues. And the other part, which I think is much more fundamental, and you know, I'm going to start it with the deliberately provocative statement, librarians are no good at picking out good resources from bad resources. Or rather, they're no better than anyone else in the world. What librarians, see, this is where people go, well, wait a minute, why are you doing this? What librarians are really, really good at, what we teach them at, what we prepare them to do, is to pick out good and bad resources for a given question, for a given user. What we're really good at is context. So when a reporter comes in and asks for a good website about hate groups using the web to recruit on the internet, pointing to the Ku Klux Klan website, good resource. 8th grader looking for an after-school program, bad resource. Same resource, but the librarian doesn't pick what's good or bad based on what they think. They base on what the user needs, right? We start back with that fundamental user need. So when you look at something like the Librarians Index to the Internet, or some of these sites that have librarians picking credible sites, for whom, for what, for when, let's face it, we have people who think Fox News is a highly credible outlet and people who think CNN's a highly credible outlet, and they're not always the same overlap. So what is credibility? Credibility means something that is an individual choice that can be trusted to change behavior. And that's what a reference interview tries to get at. And so what Reference Extract tries to do that's different from a lot of the librarians pick good sites stuff is to watch librarians picking good resources and understanding the context in which they pick them, and then using those relationships to feed information into things like Google or feed information into Reference Extract as a search engine. So one difference is scalability, build on real processes that are ongoing and not as an additional activity, but also build on the fundamental value of librarians, which is picking good resources for their communities, not picking good resources, for their communities, and understanding those communities, and then giving the tools back so that libraries can take it and tweak it and enhance it for their own users. So those are great resources out there, and we want to talk and be working with them, but this is one of the main differences that we felt required a different approach than just, let's have everyone pick 100 good websites today. We need to know why and for how and for whom, that kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks for pointing out the distinction. And we'll keep that in mind as we see more and hear more about Reference Extract and eventually get a chance to participate. And I just wanted to thank everybody for being here today. I know we have some people that need to leave and go to Reference or be in a meeting. Thanks very much, Dave, for taking the time to be here. We're glad to be here another couple minutes if people do have a question that they'd like to ask about Reference Extract or Libraries Conversation. And keep in mind that I just watched a good tutorial that I think only took about 10 minutes or so that Dave has on his website that kind of tells you a little bit more about reference extract and helps you understand the concepts behind it, and it will be a good review for some of the things that he covered today. So we'll just give this a minute and see if there are any other questions. I'll turn the mic over to John.
Thanks, Stephen. Yes, thank you, David, for giving a wonderful presentation. Looks like we had a pretty good turnout, well over 100 people. And because of the time, I'm sure some people are going to have to get going. I had a quick question for you with regards to the library's conversation and thinking about all the ways in which conversation occurs with all the types of artifacts that exist in a digital world, and specifically the way in which libraries start thinking more broadly about the type of artifacts that we play with, that we give access to. And one of the challenges that I certainly see at my university at Penn State is that in academia there is some real divisions and some silos with regards to thinking about, interactive online modules, media, online digital video, online animations, and the types of online digital content that aren't just text-based, and how libraries, play a role in not just collecting that stuff, but also helping people find it, pointing people to it. I'm just kind of curious, what are your thoughts? How does libraries conversation fit into that?
This is where I get a little info geeky, so I apologize. But think for a moment. So I was talking before about that graph that I brought up, and people were talking. In fact, let me see if I can find it here right quickly. About the idea of sort of cognitive maps and such, and building off of, here we go. We're getting there. This part is a relationship, and it's an idiosyncratic relationship, which means it's probably unique for any individual, though because we come up with thoughts and thinking socially, there's usually some great aggregation to it. It's why tags work. Tags are a very individual utility, but when you aggregate them together, they sort of make sense to people because they determine the meaning of words socially. So that's a little cognitive stuff. But it also means that how we organize them can be very idiosyncratic as well. So the example, so here's an example. I use a John Burke example, James Burke example, who's a broadcaster and historian. He talked about how the Crusaders liberating Islamic Spain at the time led to the modern university, and it goes around the line of these Crusaders took over Toledo, and there's some reason about how they did. When they took over Toledo, they found 60 major libraries with 80,000 items apiece, which was more. One library held more documents in it than the entirety of France, and they were being utilized and updated on a regular basis. When they discovered these texts, they had them translated, and all of this lost ideas that came from Greece and such were suddenly being thrust into Europe, which led to the Renaissance in part, and led to nobles in Italy who wanted to get ahead, learning Justinian and some of these original thoughts, so they hired tutors. And when they hired tutors, they eventually got together and hired tutors as a group, and this became a model of the modern university. When you follow that history, it doesn't fit nicely into a Library of Congress class of history, and it doesn't fit in nicely with a Dewey class of history. It spans all these ways we organize them. And we've built, if you think about it, our classification schemes of how we organize materials are really the end results of conversations. Right? Dewey's was a conversation, with people, and then it led into Forest Press having ongoing meetings annually to come up with new terms. And really, if you look at the Dewey classification or you look at Library of Congress, they are the answer to a conversation around the question, how do we organize the world? But they're a really specific group trying to answer that question. We force that one answer on all our users and think that improves access. And it does for the people who spend the time to learn that language, but it doesn't for the majority of our members, our users. What if instead we allow people to go in and as they find materials using Google-like tools, using search tools, using browsing tools, using conversations with librarians, they can leave a breadcrumb trail of I found this and it was related to this and it was related to this and it was related to this. We could then begin to aggregate those together saying, 90% of the people who found this went here next, and so if you find this, we suggest you take a look here. And suddenly you build this really interesting web of knowledge, web of artifacts that coming out of a knowledge process. And those may be more organic ways of finding things that are non-textual, non-format. One of the major things that we're going to have to deal with as a profession is the death of the document. The idea that documents don't mean much anymore. And you go, well, what do you mean documents don't mean anything? Well, think about it. How are your interlibrary loans looking in terms of journal access? Probably not very healthy. How are your answers to reference or to journals when you refer to journals? Do you find people looking for articles or journals? Probably articles more and more. So the notion of that binder of this is a coherent binding of a bunch of documents, we've really lost that as we move to an electronic world. And how long is it going to be before we get to sections and citations and partials? And what is Facebook? Is it a document? Well, it's a profile. No, it's not. It's an ongoing conversation. So these constant things that we can put into a container and we put a digital object identifier and we shelve it under a classification, the world's breaking that down. And so what do we have if we can't classify a thing anymore? We have conversations that have organized ideas around agreements, and they organize them in a context. And so what we need to do is begin to capture how people link things together and build systems so that people can navigate that, find it, and build their own traipses through this information. So we can leave breadcrumbs along the way so we can find them later.
Okay. So the idea then is we really want to empower the user, to engage the user in the development of linking these digital, digital ideas, digital concepts, or ideas and concepts that are expressed in a digital format, and be able to be in that conversation. I think one of the things I see, I think Stephen just put up pen tags. I think one of the ways in which the blended librarian is, and not only blended librarian, but librarians for decades have been trying to, in academia, innovate, is find ways in the classroom, in the setting where, students have the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to hopefully, do well on an assignment. That gives them a reason to perhaps make a connection with a librarian, and that gives the librarian a chance to help them make a connection with these ideas, with these concepts, and an understanding of how they relate and how they can find it and how they can, be information literate. So, okay, that makes sense. I like that. If anyone else wants to jump in on this conversation or what else David has said, I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to anyone. Stephen, if you want to jump in.
Well, I think we have time for just one more question because we are overstaying ourselves in Learning Times Network, which, and I appreciate Hope you allowing us to do that today. But there was, I think, maybe a good question to end with, and maybe there is no answer to this, Dave, but Camille Andrews, you see this here, she says, are there any examples of libraries that you might know of that are adopting this participatory approach? Are you seeing this out there anywhere? Do you have examples for models we might follow?
I put up pen tags as one example because what I like about pen tags is that a lot of them are starting examples. We have an ideal and we have ideas where that should go. We're trying to put them into effect, maybe not within a specific library, but like with reference extract across all of them, across a lot of libraries. So we're trying to build some, what Lorcan Dempsey would call network scale services that lots and lots of libraries are part of and lots of patrons are part of. Pen tags I like because, rather than looking at creating tags within the catalog, they said, wait a minute, users create these sort of social bookmarks to catalog resources and database resources and open websites and friends and buddies, and so they built a separate utility, and I thought that was a really smart choice. When you look at Ann Arbor District Library, what they've done with their catalog, I think, is a good step. And the reason I say step is that I'm not a huge fan of tagging, for example. And the reason I'm not a huge fan of tagging in general is, pick an object, write down 10 terms, then take that paper you wrote down the 10 terms and give it to someone in another room and ask them what that thing was. Now, I'm holding up a pen, and you can't start with, it's a pen, right? That's not a tag, but... And then, in 6 months, take a look at your own list and see if you could describe what it was. It's not a lot of connective tissue between terms. They're just sort of keywords off the top of your head. But it's a start because it starts to allow people at least a mechanism where they can start to link things together. The Bibliocommons work, Beth Jefferson's work up in Canada, I think is brilliant work. So I think there are some starting examples. We've put together some plans for the Philadelphia Free Library, but they're in a financial issue right now, as we all are. And we're looking for people who want to take on these ideas. I think that if you look at Multnomah County Public Library with their blogging, what's interesting is they sat down and they asked teenagers what they wanted. The teenagers told them they wanted librarians to blog, to which the librarians were really confused. Why would they want that? Well, what the teenagers were doing, they asked further questions, was they wanted reader's advisory. What should I read? But they didn't want a librarian telling them what they should read. They first wanted to know who this person was and were they interesting enough and did they care about their opinion enough that then they would read what the librarian was reading. So that's an example where they use blogging technology in a response to facilitate this conversation around reading, using participatory technologies such as blogging and such, but for a purpose. They ask the why and the why not questions. So there are a few scattered examples, and we're always looking to build more. Where we are right now was sort of year one was conceptualization, year two was building an example based in case studies, and now we're to the point where we want to really build tools like reference extract and mention scapes, and we really are looking for people who want to get down and dirty and implement. So thanks for taking up so much time. I appreciate those who stayed around.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be our guest today and to enlighten us with the kinds of work that you're doing. And, we did have that little comment there about, we need to hear some theory every now and then, and I think it's actually good, and I appreciate that you said that it's really our responsibility to take what you're saying and put it into practice in our libraries and to try to be innovative in that way. So I want to thank the Learning Times and Hope Candell for being our moderator today and helping us with the program. We appreciate your helping us as always, Hope. And again, for those of you who are left, thanks so much for participating, and sorry if we didn't get to your question, but we hope that we'll see you back here in the spring for some new webcasts, and that you will visit David Lanke's website and learn more about the interesting things that he's working on with his colleagues at Syracuse and around the world, really. So we look forward to hearing from you in the future and seeing you in the community, and take care until next time. Thank you.